In October of 1814, 8 people in London were killed by beer. Not by drinking too much beer. Not in a bar fight over beer. No, they were killed by a literal tidal wave of beer. A 15-foot-tall tsunami of dark brown porter came crashing through the streets of London, demolishing houses, flooding basements, and turning an entire neighborhood into the world's worst pool party. Over 300,000 gallons of beer, moving at the speed of a runaway carriage, through a slum. And here's the best part. After all of that, after the destruction, after the deaths, after the city literally smelled like a frat house for months, the court ruled that nobody was at fault. The official legal verdict? It was an act of God. Apparently, God really wanted London to have a beer flood that day. Welcome to one of the dumbest disasters in human history, and let's set the scene. It's 1814, London. The city is crowded, filthy, and running almost entirely on beer because the water was so contaminated that drinking it was basically a coin flip between hydration and cholera. Beer wasn't a luxury. Beer was survival. So naturally, London's breweries were massive industrial operations, and none was more ridiculous than the Horse Shoe Brewery, owned by a company called Moo and Company, sitting right at the corner of Tottenham Court Road. Now, breweries in this era had a very normal, very healthy competition going on. And by that I mean a completely insane ego contest over who could build the biggest beer vat. This wasn't about efficiency. This was about bragging rights. One brewery had famously built a vat so enormous they held a dinner party inside it. 200 people eating dinner inside a beer tank. So Moo and Company looked at that and said, "Cute, hold our porter." They built a wooden vat 22 feet tall, held together by 81 metric tons of iron hoops, containing over 3,500 barrels of aging porter, a dark beer that had been fermenting for months. 3,500 barrels of pressurized, fermenting liquid, held back by wood, in a building surrounded by one of the poorest, most densely packed slums in all of London, the St. Giles Rookery, where entire families crammed into single basement rooms. What could possibly go wrong? October 17th, 1814, around 4:30 in the afternoon, a storehouse clerk named George Crick is doing his rounds when he notices something a little concerning. One of the massive iron hoops on the giant vat has slipped off. 700 pounds of iron just fell off. Clank. Now, you might think this would trigger some kind of emergency. Alarms, evacuations, something. But George had seen this before. Hoops popped off these vats 2 or 3 times a year, apparently, which is a sentence that should terrify everyone. So he did what any responsible employee would do. He shrugged. He reported it to his supervisor, and the supervisor's response was, and I'm barely paraphrasing here, "No harm will come of it. Write a letter to have it fixed later." A letter? The vat holding 500,000 liters of pressurized beer is losing its structural support, and the official company response was to file some paperwork. George sat down to write his little memo. He never finished it, because about an hour later, at around 5:30 p.m., the vat had a different idea. It exploded, and when I say exploded, I don't mean it leaked. I don't mean it cracked. I mean the entire 22-foot vat ruptured with such catastrophic force that the blast knocked the valve off a neighboring vat, and then another one, setting off a chain reaction of bursting beer tanks like the world's most alcoholic domino rally. The explosion blew out the brewery's back wall, a brick wall, sending debris flying into the street. Bricks from the brewery reportedly landed on rooftops across the road. In seconds, more than 320,000 gallons of porter were free. And beer, it turns out, does not politely trickle. A wave of dark liquid, estimated at 15 feet high, came roaring out of the brewery and straight into New Street and the surrounding slum. 15 feet. That's a 2-story building made of beer, moving fast enough to knock down brick walls, which it did, immediately demolishing 2 houses and partially collapsing a pub called the Tavistock Arms, where a 14-year-old barmaid named Eleanor Cooper was buried under the rubble while washing pots outside. And remember those basement rooms I mentioned? The ones where entire poor families lived because it was all they could afford? Beer flows downhill. Those basements filled up like bathtubs. People were suddenly swimming in the dark in their own homes in a rising tide of lukewarm porter. The scene in St. Giles was absolute pandemonium. In one basement, a woman named Mary Banfield was having tea with her 4-year-old daughter when the wave hit their home. In another house, an Irish family was holding a wake, a funeral gathering, for a 2-year-old boy who had died the day before. The beer wave crashed through the room, killing the grieving mother and 4 other mourners. Yes. The beer flood interrupted a funeral and created more funerals. History has absolutely no chill. Meanwhile, above ground, the streets of St. Giles were knee-deep in porter, and the neighborhood's reaction was complicated. Rescuers waded in, desperately digging through rubble and calling for silence so they could hear survivors trapped under debris. And according to the legends that grew afterwards, some of the locals looked at the free river of beer flowing past their doors and thought, well, it would be rude not to. Stories spread of people scooping it up in pots, pans, and their bare hands. Later, tall tales even claimed someone died of alcohol poisoning. Days after, well, though historians will tell you that part's probably a myth, the confirmed deaths were all from drowning and debris, which is somehow worse. 8 people, all of them women and children, killed by a beverage. The brewery workers themselves mostly survived, including George Crick, our memo-writing hero, though several had to be pulled from the wreckage, and George's own brother was injured in the collapse. The smell of beer soaked into the entire district and reportedly lingered for months, an entire neighborhood, marinating in porter. So, 8 dead, houses destroyed, a pub flattened, a funeral turned into a mass casualty event. Surely someone was held accountable, right? Ha 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 ha. No. The inquest was held just days later, and the jury delivered their verdict. The deaths were casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. An act of God. Nobody's fault. Not the company that built a skyscraper of beer next to a slum. Not the supervisor who responded to structural failure with "write a letter." God did it. Case closed. But it gets better, and by better I mean so much worse. Moo and company didn't just avoid punishment, they got a refund. The company petitioned Parliament, arguing that they'd already paid excise taxes on all that spilled beer, and Parliament agreed to waive the duties, a rebate worth thousands of pounds. So the final scoreboard, 8 poor Londoners dead, 0 consequences, and the brewery got government money back. The victims' families? They relied on charity donations and public sympathy. Some residents reportedly charged visitors a small fee to view the beer-soaked wreckage of their homes, because when life gives you a beer flood, you make admission tickets, apparently, the one genuinely good outcome. The disaster helped push the entire industry to slowly abandon giant wooden vats in favor of lined concrete ones. The Horse Shoe Brewery itself kept operating for another century before being demolished. And today, the Dominion Theatre stands roughly where it stood. Thousands of people watch musicals every year on the site of London's great beer Tsunami, and most of them have no idea. So, what did we learn? We learned that in 1814, structural engineering meant stacking iron hoops on wood and hoping. We learned that the correct emergency response to a failing megavat is apparently a strongly worded letter. And we learned that if your company kills 8 people with beer, the British government might just hand you a tax refund and call it divine intervention. God works in mysterious ways, and evidently some of those ways are carbonated. If you enjoyed watching history make absolutely no sense whatsoever, do your future self a favor and subscribe to Sticky Storm. Because human beings have never stopped making decisions this stupid, and I will personally be here to roast every single one of them. Drop a comment telling me whether you would have grabbed a pot and started scooping. Be honest, we both know the answer. See you in the next disaster.